For the past 36 years, The Legend of Zelda has long been heralded as the pinnacle of action-adventure gaming. And for good reason. I mean, everybody wants to play as a kid swinging a sword around breaking your neighbor's pots, right? Jokes aside, there are actually many reasons why Zelda games have captivated audiences for several generations now, and one of the biggest reasons is the characters. These 3 recurring characters make up the famous trio that's even present on the official Zelda website and is set to make a reappearance in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. But since we still don't even know the name of the upcoming game, and the last time Nintendo mentioned the series was on its Nintendo of America account back in March, I figured we'd look at the past instead of the future of the franchise, and instead focus on how these beloved and highly recognizable and marketable characters came to be. Along the way, if you find yourself liking this video, please consider liking the video. And if you find yourself liking me, please consider subscribing. Chances are high that you'll like my other stuff, and you can always unsubscribe later. Anyway, to talk about who or what inspired the Zelda trio, we first have to talk about a brief history of character art in video games. When the Zelda trio first appeared in the world of gaming, the world was simpler. The technology at the time was such that games looked like a bunch of squares moving around on the screen. I mean, technically they still are since everything is just pixels anyway, but on the NES, which was the system that The Legend of Zelda released on in 1986, the maximum resolution output was a whopping 256 horizontal pixels by 240 vertical. For reference, this is what that looks like compared to a modern full HD resolution standard of 1920 by 1080, which is what I rendered this video in. And people used to say these games have great graphics.
Whoa, nice graphics!
Because of these extremely constrictive parameters for what can appear on screen in a video game, game developers at the time had to try to design main characters to be as recognizable as possible. And this is why Miyamoto and team came up with the idea of having Zelda's main character have a sword and shield that's kind of supersized and indistinguishable from Link's final silhouette. And just like they did with Mario by designing his hat and giant nose to be recognizable, they designed Link with a long hat and giant pointy ears instead of a giant rounded nose. And when they were thinking about a character with a pointed hat and ears that loves adventure, being huge Disney fans, Miyamoto and co were immediately reminded of the one and only Peter Pan. According to Miyamoto himself, they began to take inspiration from Peter Pan, and that's actually why Link's clothes are green. And since Peter Pan is a child, they also decided to make Link a child as opposed to his platforming counterpart Mario, which actually worked out very well because the entire idea behind The Legend of Zelda stemmed from memories of Shigeru Miyamoto's childhood, which he says consisted of many days of whimsical exploration of the Japanese countryside in the 1950s. He even happened upon a massive cave system, which he eventually worked up the nerve to explore all by himself with the light of a lantern, and found an undocumented lake on the top of a hill, which all sounds really cool, which is why he made The Legend of Zelda. He wanted to impart that feeling from his younger days of exploration and imagination to gamers all over the world, and thus the character that would carry out this adventure, who was inspired by Peter Pan visually, would end up being the child known as Link. Oh, and his name, by the way, came from the notion that the original Zelda game would take place in both the past and future. So Link would literally be the link between the timelines. I'm not joking, this is all from direct quotes from interviews of Miyamoto. Moving on, the same trope that was used in the Donkey Kong / Super Mario Bros. Franchise of a damsel in distress which the hero must save, which by the way was literally based off of the Popeye cartoon, was also used in The Legend of Zelda, because let's face it, we all want to play as a hero who has to save somebody. When coming up with the idea for who Link would have to save though, it was actually a public relations agent working for Nintendo at the time that suggested that the character of the woman needing saving would be a lady of eternal beauty. Kind of a legendary concept in and of itself. They wanted to come up with a name that sounded like a legendary beauty, but instead of fabricating one, the same agent then suggested that they use the unique name of the wife of a famous American author known as F. Scott Fitzgerald. She was a woman who was known for her beauty and being an author and dancer, and her name was Zelda, and thus Princess Zelda was created. Her visual design doesn't have any spectacular or specific details as to why she ended up initially being a redhead wearing a pink dress, but we can only assume that her coloration was decided upon in order to contrast with the green of Link or the blue of Ganon. And what a crafty segue into talking about the creation of Ganon. See, once upon a time in Austin, Texas, a mommy Akita and a daddy Akita loved each other very much, and Ganon was created. Then I drove down and paid a lot of money to... sorry, wrong Ganon. The original Ganon from The Legend of Zelda was created because the game needed a villain, obviously, but instead of going the same route that Mario did with the King Kong-ish big monkey Donkey Kong, just kind of blindly wanting to steal a lady away, they felt that because Zelda was more of an adventure and had a bigger concentration on good versus evil, evil, the villain needed to be someone a bit more sinister and, you know, evil. His original name when they were developing The Legend of Zelda was actually Hakai, short for Cho Hakai. But where did that name come from, you ask? Great question. They wanted to stick with the idea of an animalistic villain that worked out so well for Donkey Kong, so they actually pulled inspiration from an older fictional novel set in 7th century China. The book deals with ancient Chinese mythology and is called Journey to the West in English. It was written by Wu Chongon in 1592 as one of his 4 great classical novels of Chinese literature. The book itself was about the journey of Sun Wukong, or better known as the Monkey King, and one of the main characters in the book is the deeply complicated, sometimes friend, sometimes foe, half-man, half-pig monster known as Zhu Baiji, or in Japanese, Cho Hakai, aka Ganon. Hakai in the book has kind of a similar story to Lucifer from the Bible. He was once a great general of heaven, but had a bit too much to drink one night and tried to have his way with Chang'e, the goddess of the moon, and was subsequently cast down to earth by the Jade Emperor, where he was reborn from a pig well as a man-eating pig monster. I won't go into all the details of his story because, you know, there's a whole book about it, but in a nutshell, Hakai is a deeply developed anthropomorphic pig monster who ultimately cannot resist the wiles of his physical temptations, whether it be for food or lust, and is often used as a villain in the story, even going so far as to, get this, kidnap the daughter of a village elder and demand her hand in marriage. If that sounds familiar, it's because that's literally Ganon, who, like I said, was named Hakai before the game was released. A deeper, more sinister, pig-like villain was perfect for the battle of good versus evil that The Legend of Zelda would handle, and thus Ganon was designed as an anthropomorphic pig monster who kidnapped Princess Zelda out of his lust for power. But the depth of his character that stemmed from his roots in his Chinese mythological character counterpart remained inside the minds of the Zelda developers, even though there wasn't much to begin with in the original game. And this is why Ganon was given an actual backstory in the 3rd Zelda game, A Link to the Past, when it was revealed via the game booklet that he used to be a man with a first and last name known as Ganondorf Dragmire. Now at this point, all 3 characters were established in the first game, and in the games to follow, they made reappearances and were redesigned based off of their old designs combined with the new direction for the games in Zelda 2, A Link to the Past, and Link's Awakening. So I won't go into specific details on those games. However, things got really interesting once again when Nintendo made the famous jump to 3D with the Nintendo 64. Redesigning the Mario characters to now be featured in 3 dimensions was easy because everyone's designs were already so recognizable, and the target audience for the games was everyone with a focus on children, so there was a need to keep everybody as recognizable as possible. But for The Legend of Zelda's evolution in Ocarina of Time, the team had some other things to consider. See, Zelda was popular in Japan, but it was super popular in other parts of the world, namely America, where we're a big fan of good versus evil stories. And their audience worldwide that was a fan of The Legend of Zelda for all those reasons were now 10 years older. Because of this, Nintendo wanted to focus a bit more heavily on really nailing the theme of having cool and more mature and better looking characters than ever before, which is why they decided to design teenage heroes instead of just children, with the ability to travel in between timelines that they've always wanted to do. At the same time, the wife of the man in charge of the character design for Ocarina of Time, a man named Yoshiaki Koizumi, explained to him that Nintendo's characters were all weird looking. No joke, this inspired him to make several changes to the cooler adult Link's face, such as making his nose narrower and stronger and cutting back on his previously iconic long sideburns, and giving him pierced ears. He also gave him that long white visible underwear so as to not make him too cool, apparently, even though I personally think he looks cooler with them, but you know, it's whatever. Anyway, he then entrusted the fine details to an artist working under him known as Yusuke Nakano, who reportedly designed Link's face after a, quote, world-famous Hollywood actor. Now, we've never gotten a confirmation as to who exactly he was referring to, but without going into too much jargon trying to explain why, the chances are highest given the timing in the 90s and the age of Link and the reference to American actors that the actor who inspired Link's appearance in Ocarina of Time was none other than Leonardo DiCaprio, the blonde, teenaged 90s heartthrob. Honestly, I could see it. Now, Princess Zelda's jump to 3D was a bit less drastic, since they more or less kept her initial royal getup with the tiara and Triforce earrings and tabard laid over a dress from A Link to the Past. They tweaked several things though, like the colors, by making her tabard more of a purple than pink, but added in some new stuff like long gloves, a turtleneck, and my favorite, lore implications by placing the Sheikah symbol beneath the Triforce on her tabard. But other than that, Zelda pretty much looked the same. Now, Ganon, on the other hand, got perhaps the biggest redesign of all of them by making his anthropomorphic pig monsterness taller and lankier and now wielding 2 swords instead of a trident. But the biggest change was that you don't even see Ganon until the very end of the game. In fact, you don't even hear his name. Ganon's backstory from A Link to the Past was expounded upon in Ocarina of Time by bringing the character known as Ganondorf Dragmire to life for the first time, who is the main villain that we follow throughout the game. Ganondorf is undoubtedly one of the coolest parts of Ocarina of Time, and again, since the developers at Nintendo knew they needed to design a character that was both intriguing, but also intimidating for their growing teenage audience, they needed to think big, literally. And just like Link was designed based off of an actor, Ganondorf was also designed based off of another American actor, known as Christopher Lambert, from Highlander. Now, Lambert might not be that big, standing at 5'10", but he does have some pretty big facial features which reappeared on Ganondorf's facial design. To start with, the man has a hell of a forehead, which is the most obvious detail that Ganondorf also shares, although he normally covers that up with a Gerudo gemstone. The lower, stern brow and sharp nose also made it over to Ganondorf's face, and as such has resulted in one of the most recognizable and intimidating villains in video game history. And since Ocarina of Time, the Zelda trio have gone through several other redesigns, but in each case it's entirely related to the style of that particular Zelda game. A super cartoony bobblehead in Wind Waker, super darkly edgy in Twilight Princess, small town storybook vibes in Skyward Sword, and finally a brand new blend of all of them in Breath of the Wild. As far as their origins though, you may now consider yourself a bona fide expert, unless you already knew all of this. Either way though, let me know what you thought about this video and if you learned something new in the comments below. And also let me know if you'd like me to cover any other topic of any other game under the sun. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you in advance for liking the video if you haven't already, and for subscribing if you haven't already. You totally should though. Huge thanks as always to my bandit crew, of which I have the new name of Damiana M to announce. That's all I've got in this one, so be sure to follow me on my socials. Links are in the description below. I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your day. This is Bandit, looking forward to seeing you next time, and signing out. Peace!